Synopsis of the books of the Bible. Major Prophets. Jeremiah. By JND Darby. Chapters 45 to 51. Encouragement to individual faithfulness, judgment of nations and Babylon. Jeremiah 45 gives us the prophecy with respect to Baruch, already mentioned. Jeremiah 46 and following chapters contain the prophecies against the Gentiles around Judea, and against Babylon herself. We shall find these special elements in the prophecies that refer to the nations. The judgments are not those of the last days, as in Isaiah, but, according to the general character of the book, refer to the destruction of the different nations, in order to make way for the dominion of one sole empire. It is thus that, in the case of Judea, the judgment is even now executed. God's ways in government with the nations and his people. But there is a difference with respect to the restoration of those nations in the last days. Egypt, Elam, Moab, Ammon, are restored in the last days. Edom, Damascus, Philistia, Hazor, are not. The reason for this is easily seen. Egypt and Elam form no part of the land of Israel. God in his goodness will have compassion in those countries. They shall be inhabited and blessed under his government. When the people of Israel entered Canaan, Ammon and Moab were to be spared. They were not Canaanites under the curse, and however deplorable their origin might be, yet, being related to the family of Israel, their land was preserved to them, although to the 10th generation they could not be admitted into the congregation of Israel. Deuteronomy 23 verse 3. And when God shall put an end to the dominion given to Nebuchadnezzar, and to the empire of the Gentiles, these nations shall again enter into the countries that were allotted them. But, although Edom had been spared, and was even to be received amongst Israel in their 3rd generation, yet as their hatred to Israel had been unbounded, they should be totally destroyed in the judgment of that day. Compare Obadiah throughout, especially in verse 18. Their land should form a part of Israel's territory, and was, in fact, a part of it, although they themselves were spared at the beginning as the brethren of Israel, but only, alas, to abuse this favor, so that the judgment would be more terrible upon them than upon the rest. Damascus, Hazor, and Philistia were a part of the land of Israel, properly so called. These nations disappear as distinct nations, as to their territory. At the close of the judgment on Egypt, God sends words of encouragement to Israel. Israel had learnt on Pharaoh when Nebuchadnezzar had attacked Jerusalem. The Egyptian power appeared to be the only one capable of balancing that of Babylon. But God had ordained the fall of Egypt, who would willingly have taken the chief place. This was, however, appointed for Babylon. The country from which they were brought out, the world, considered as man in his natural independent character, organizing in his own strength, would like to prevail over idolatrous corruption and Babylonish principles, but these were to be in force until the time appointed by God when God will judge them. Now Israel having lent upon Egypt would apparently fall with Egypt, but God watched over them, and they were to return from their captivity and dwell in peace. The ways of God in government are well worthy of attention here. God would judge the nations. He would chastise Israel in measure. His people should not be condemned with the world. Grace abused brings down the most terrible judgments. Thus it was with Edom. The destruction of Babylon. Babylon yet remains. But, in Jeremiah, all the judgments are contemplated in connection with the setting aside of the independent nations, and the establishment of the one empire of the Gentiles, the chief subject of this prophecy. Consequently the prophet is specially occupied with the historical fate of the empire, as established by God in the prophet's own days. It is Babylon and the land of the Chaldeans which are the subject of his prophecy. It is the judgment of this empire, to avenge the oppression of Israel by Nebuchadnezzar, who had broken his bones. Chapter 50 verse 17. Nevertheless, the deliverance of Israel, at the time of the destruction of Babylon, is given as a pledge and foretaste of their complete and final deliverance. Jeremiah 50 verses 4 to 19, 20 and 34. See also Jeremiah 51 verses 19 to 21. For the destruction of Babylon was the judgment of that which God had himself established as the Gentile empire. This is the reason why, even historically, her judgment was accompanied by the deliverance of Israel and the destruction of idolatry, by a man raised up to execute the righteousness of God. It has not been at all the same thing with the other empires, although, no doubt, they were also set up by the providence of God. But in their case it was not the immediate establishment of the empire on God's part, placing man in it under responsibility. Man, thus placed, had completely failed. He has tyrannized over God's people, established a compulsory idolatry, and corrupted the world by its means. Looked at as having the dominion of the world, which had been committed to him. He has been judged, and Babylon is fallen. It is important thoroughly to apprehend this truth with respect to this first empire. In principle, the deliverance of Israel results from it, whatever the subsequent dealings of God may have been. See also the character of this judgment, Jeremiah 50 verses 28, 33 and 34. The next chapter furnishes us also with important principles in connection with this destruction of Babylon. God's unchangeable faithfulness to Israel. Jeremiah 51 verse 6 reveals the unchangeable faithfulness of God to Israel, in spite of the people's sins. It was the time of the Lord's vengeance. When the time that God indicated should have arrived, a time to be known only by those whose spiritual discernment would enable them to apply the prophecy, the elements of which were given clearly enough in these two chapters, especially in the assaults of the nations, then those who had ears to hear were to leave the city. Moreover, the fall of Babylon was a judgment pronounced upon idolatry. The portion of Jacob, Jehovah, might chastise his people, but he was not like the vanities of the Gentiles. After having chastised them, he would bring forth his righteousness in contrast with the Gentiles, who oppressed them, and would, finally, use them as his weapons of war. From verse 25 we see that it is the Babylon of those days which is in question. From verse 29 the historical circumstances that are related give us a very special proof of this.